Well, to look at a very eventful week in federal politics, including the inquiry into the Emergencies Act, I'm joined now by two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Tonda MacCharles is a national political reporter with the Toronto Star, and she's at the site of the inquiry. And Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail, and he's here with me in studio. Both of you, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here.
Hi, Maritn.
Okay, let's start with the inquiry. For weeks now, we have been hearing at the inquiry from police forces who have pointed the finger at each other for being unprepared or disorganized, who said that they never asked for the Emergencies Act to be invoked, but who have said that it did help somewhat when it was invoked. Yesterday, we started to hear the federal side of things, the federal framing of the issue. A crucial figure, the Prime Minister's National Security Advisor, Jody Thomas, she described why she decided that the occupation was a threat to national security, and she also put some of the blame for the need of invoking the Act at the feet of RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki. Tonda, your thoughts on that pivot and where the testimony, that sort of change that we saw this week?
Well, all week long, actually, we've been hearing, it wasn't just Jody Thomas, we've been hearing from senior federal officials, from senior RCMP brass, and then at the top of the national security and intelligence food chain in the PMO and the PCO was Jody Thomas's testimony yesterday. And look, I'm not sure that you could say she laid all the blame or part of the blame at RCMP Commissioner Lucki's feet, but she certainly took a broad side at Lucki for not advising the cabinet directly about the existence of an operational police plan that was, by then, we understand to have been at least finalized but not signed off on. And she did not directly advise the ministers at two key cabinet meetings that she was attending virtually, that she did not believe, actually, at that point, police had exhausted all available legal tools to them, and that, in fact, you know, a plan in the works for Ottawa would use provincial emergencies measures. So it raises the question that had the cabinet ministers at that meeting known those two important facts, might they have delayed the invocation of the Act? We don't know. By then, the Windsor Bridge operation had been underway for 2 days. That bridge was, the blockades were lifted, the lanes of traffic weren't open, and what we've heard today, Friday, was that some of the very senior security officials in the Privy Council office advising the Prime Minister were very concerned that the Windsor Bridge blockade would start up again, that protests across the country, in their view, were not abating by then. They were, in fact, still escalating. There were some 10 blockades across the country that they were worried about. So I think that, you know, hearing the national picture that was being fed into the cabinet decision-making is really interesting. Hearing senior bureaucrats involved in the decision-making taking shots at each other, and also saying, look, we've got a whole we've got a broader definition of what the threat to Canada was for invoking that Act. Then, you know, you might see in narrow pieces of legislation. So all fascinating testimony leading up to a blockbuster week next week when we hear from the cabinet ministers and the Prime Minister.
We'll get to that in a second. Bob, your paper was commenting on the sort of repercussions on RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki, as Tonda mentions, if not blaming her for the Emergencies Act. Obviously there was, and she admitted, Brenda Lucki this week said that she admitted she regretted not bringing up these vital points, that there was a police plan to take care of the occupation of downtown Ottawa. Your paper's been talking about the kind of reputational damage she sustained.
Well, look, this was a very bad week for Commissioner Lucki. Her performance before the commission was, to say the least, rather disturbing. Tonda has outlined some of the testimony, but throughout the testimony she was vacillating, very weak, and this is not the first time. I mean, she made a mess of the Nova Scotia inquiry into the mass murder when she berated her officers and said that they should have released details on the guns that were used to kill those people, and because she wanted to help the Liberals' gun legislation. That spawned parliamentary committees. She almost immediately after she became a commissioner, she landed in hot water about saying that there may not be systematic discrimination within the RCMP, which is ludicrous. So she's not going to get reappointed. I'll put money on that. The senior officials I've spoken in the government have been very disillusioned, dissatisfied with her performance, not only in the inquiry and what Tonda has outlined, but on these other issues that I have. So she won't get reappointed because she shouldn't. But she shouldn't have been appointed in the first place. She was a mid-level depot commander. She had no experience in Ottawa. And, you know, you need to have headquarters experience because you are dealing with politicians and cabinet, and you need to have that kind of experience, which she did not have.
Okay, let's turn to, and Tonda alluded to it, and I think I alluded to it, next week is going to be a week, in a way, it's a culmination of the whole inquiry. It's going to be a blockbuster week because we're going to hear from 7 federal ministers, Public Safety Minister, Emergency Measures Minister, Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland as well as the Prime Minister himself. What are you anticipating? What are you watching for, Tonda?
Look, I'm most keen, I think, to understand what was in the mindset of 2 of the key ministers, the Public Safety Minister and the Emergency Preparedness Minister, Mendicino and Blair. And then, of course, what was in the mind of the Prime Minister. How were they processing the information and advice coming into them? And how were they viewing the level of police dysfunction that we've seen ample evidence of at this inquiry? To what extent did they get, you know, we've heard at the inquiry police agencies saying, oh, well, you know, the tools were useful, but they weren't needed. We were going to take care of the situation, when in fact, they weren't. Things weren't happening. Only at Windsor were things moving. And then the next morning, Monday morning, when the Emergencies Act was invoked, at Coutts did we see an enforcement action against a cache of weapons. But it was the protesters themselves, once that happened, that decided to leave because they realized their message was completely obscured. So I want to hear from those ministers. They were in key decision-making positions, and they were, I'm pretty sure, as a former Crown prosecutor and a former police chief who was at the G20, that their advice to Trudeau and the fellow cabinet ministers was pretty informative and key. And I guess everybody wants to know why Trudeau, who throughout the global pandemic and throughout the rail blockades of 2020 did not ever invoke the Emergencies Act and had never really wanted to because his father had invoked its predecessor, the War Measures Act. Why is it that they got to that point that they felt it necessary to bring down the hammer of the Emergencies Act?
Okay, Bob, because I want to get to another issue, but what are you watching for?
Well, look, the Public Safety Minister, Marco Mendicino, had said that the government invoked the Emergencies Act on the advice of the police.
That the police
that
asked
is not
for it.
true.
Yeah.
They've all testified that that is not true. In fact, we now even have the CSIS, our spy agency, saying it did not meet the threshold required for a national security emergency to invoke that. So I want to know, I think Marco Mendicino is going to be in trouble. I'd like to hear what he's going to say about to get himself out of that mess. Yeah. But also, what led the Prime Minister to do this? If CISA says it didn't meet the Act, who was telling you that this was the right thing to do?
Or, as we heard from Jody Thomas, they are redefining the nature
but you
of
don't
a national emergency.
If you're going to redefine it, then change the law to redefine it. You don't redefine it before it.
Okay, we will be watching with interest. So I want to get to the last, the second subject of this week, and it really is one. The Prime Minister has wrapped up his Asian tour, and this was an undercurrent for the entire 3-summit tour: the ASEAN summit, the G20 summit, and the APEC summit, which is just wrapped up. Canada-China relations. Justin Trudeau raised the issue of Chinese interference with Canadians and with Canadian elections. He raised it with Chinese President Xi Jinping. The next day, President Xi scolded the Prime Minister for making the discussion public, and more importantly, from people who watched that tape, he said there would be consequences. Bob, what are you watching for?
Well, look, I don't know whether there's going to be any consequences or not. I mean, you know, they've punished us in the past, but our trade is actually up with them. Yeah. So I don't think we're going to be invited for any sit-down with the Chinese for a while. But what we need to see is, instead of Mr. Trudeau grandstanding, how about doing something concretely? For example, bringing in a Foreign Registry Act, which members of Parliament have been asking for, including members of Parliament who were defeated, we believe, because of Chinese influence. That's what we need. So we know who is working for the Chinese in public life and in corporations, and the Americans have it, the Australians have it. It's a very effective tool. So, Mr. Trudeau, if you're serious about this interference, do something about it.
Okay, Tonda, briefly, what are you comments on this overwhelming or underlying theme during all of this tour in Asia, the Canada-China relations?
Yeah, Canada-China relations, pick any Asian country, their relationship with China is also sort of a dominant factor. It's interesting that Justin Trudeau went there without having formulated his Indo-Pacific strategy. Let's see if there's going to be a big shift or changes as a result. Will he feel that he needs to take a tougher line on China? Will he do some of the things that Bob suggested? I think those are still big questions.
And, well, some say that the policy was semi-released by Madame Joly in the week before he left. But, yeah, it's still, the government says officially the Indo-Pacific strategy has still not been released.
Right. And it matters if it's just a white paper or if it's actually actions and money to boot.
Right. And you spoke to our new, Tonda, you had a sit down with a new ambassador to China. She mentioned that as well. It was a question about when will the strategy be coming out.
We should be getting it when
well,
he comes back.
Yeah, I expect it within about a couple of weeks after Trudeau gets back.
That's it. They've been promising.
But, you know, I will say this. This is, I mean, what we've seen from the overview that Melanie Joly gave us is that there is a real movement from the government to recognize the credible threat that China is facing, not only in the Pacific, but also the world. This is a view that they have not, it's taken them a long time to get to this point. All of our Western allies have reached that point. We're finally catching up, and that's a good thing. I mean, the government should be complimented for that, and we've seen not only the Indo-Pacific strategy overview, but we've seen both Ms. Freeland and an innovation minister, you know, stopping Chinese takeovers of critical minerals. Ms. Freeland talking about how we're going to have to be friend sharing with other companies, so we don't just rely on China, which we've discovered during the pandemic, the supply chain problems we have. So I think the government's finally getting to a point where we're taking China more seriously.
Melanie Joly, who openly warned Canadian business people doing business with China that they are going to be, according to her, according to the government, dealing with a regime which she says is going to be less and less respectful of international standards and international law. Listen, we will watch for that. I want to thank both of you, and Tonda, we'll let you get back to the inquiry. Thanks for joining us, both of you.
Thanks, Maritn.